because it comes down to economics. And if this is the most efficient way to manage balancing services and manage the grid, then we should go and pursue it.
The market for battery storage, and I'm talking about the kind connected to power grids and stabilizing the volatile power generation of renewables, will grow very quickly. In the next 5 years, it will increase approximately eightfold. Demand will grow particularly strong in Europe, which bears the question, which role does grid storage already play in the current energy crisis? And what are generally hurdles and obstacles that we see in the area of grid infrastructure? You'll get answers in this episode. Welcome to the Smartery podcast, a podcast for and with the creators of the new energy world. A world in which energy will be renewable, decentralized and digital, bringing together electricity, heat and mobility. Let us show you how we will get there and who will get us there. As always, we try to find an expert which is in a prime position to give us insights into the topic of this episode. And in this case, it's Julian Jansen, the Growth and Market Development Director at Fluence. And Fluence just happens to be the leading global energy storage technology and service provider. It's been in the market for quite a while already and originally was launched by Siemens and AES as a joint venture, so two rather significant players. Welcome, Julian.
Hi, Zach. Good to be on the podcast.
Of course, we have a lot of technical questions, a lot of market questions, but we want to start with the most urgent and pressing issue and also the most emotional. That is the ongoing energy crisis in Europe, specifically also here in Germany, caused by the war in Ukraine. So to what extent can storage facilities alleviate the ongoing energy crisis as we speak?
Yeah, Zach, this is a really critical question and a really pressing question, as you rightly say. Fundamentally, what the energy crisis is leading to is to us rethinking our long-term energy strategic goals and realigning energy security, energy cost, and sustainability of our energy supply. So, for example, with the new REPowerEU plan, we're targeting an increase of renewable sources in energy generation to around 45%, up from the previous target of 40%. And as we are bringing all this new renewable capacity online, but also trying to reduce the reliance on natural gas, this is really where storage comes in and provides the value that we need in this current time. Fundamentally, storage helps reduce price volatility in the wholesale markets. It reduces reliance and technology lock-in, in particular with natural gas-based generation and flexibility markets. It helps increase energy security, and it also enables higher penetration of renewables by reducing curtailment and therefore allowing greater levels of renewables, which is the cheapest form of power generation, to be fed into our grid and ultimately leading to a more sustainable but also a lower cost supply of electricity.
Now, in theory, that does sound wonderful, what you just said. Now, I have two practical questions. You mentioned Repower Europe. As I understood also from a blog article on the Fluence site that you also published, is that Repower Europe is strong in the ramp up in renewables, but really has a big gap in matching the storage ramp up. And the other thing is, coming back to my original question, how immediate could that effect be for the ongoing energy crisis, speaking the next months or even next winter?
No, very good point to add there. And I think let's start by answering the second question first, actually, because of course, we're not going to have gigawatts of energy storage online within the next 3 months, right? That's not feasible. It takes around, let's say, about 14 to 18 months from an investment decision for the project to be operational. But certainly existing facilities, and we already have gigawatts of storage, both battery-based energy storage and pumped hydro energy storage installed in Europe. So utilizing those plants to their full effect will have an impact already this winter. But then when we're looking into the next winter and the medium-term realignment of our energy goals, that's where storage will really be the pivotal role within that. And that's coming then to your first question, talking about the integration of energy storage into current policy frameworks. It is correct that the current energy policies at a European level fail to create a market environment that really supports the rapid, large-scale, accelerated deployment of new storage. So for us, it's really critical that in order for these new plans under REPowerEU, under the emergency measures, and all the different actions taken at the member state level, it is critical that we need to accompany these with adequate targets and policy frameworks for storage, as well as other flexibility technologies, by the way, way. And these are really necessary to enable the safe and efficient integration of renewables. And it's really now the time to recognize energy storage and flexibility technology as a critical pillar to the European energy transition.
And now I want to break it down from the strategic level to a very practical level. And the question, what would be the fastest and cheapest way to prevent renewable energies from being shut down in times of energy crisis? Like, what would that really mean? Is it like, for example, a storage unit at every PV station or installment at every single wind energy plant, or how would it practically play out?
It's actually a really need for holistic planning. It's not a single kind of silver bullet solution that's the way forward. And ultimately, we need to prepare the build out of renewables and the phase out of fossil fuel, and in particular natural gas-based generation, by allowing those flexibility technologies and storage to match the pace that we're seeing elsewhere. So really, when we're looking at the question you're asking around where should storage be located, there is a need around co-locating it with solar or with wind, but certainly not at every plant. You could, for example, install storage at a substation level, connected to multiple wind farms, multiple PV plants. There is some advantages co-locating, but at the same time, we also have to think about integrating storage into existing transmission and distribution infrastructure, where it can help reduce congestion, make that infrastructure more efficient. We need to think about how we integrate distributed energy storage and distributed generation into that mix, and also think about flexible loads. So it is really a holistic planning approach, but from a storage perspective, it is the need at a co-located level, it is the need of storage in the grid and supporting infrastructure, and storage also at a distributed level to help energy customers manage their energy demand and their energy cost in a more effective way.
To put it in my non-expert terms, you need to integrate it really at every level of the grid and energy production.
That's the way to describe it, correct.
Now, one project that Fluence is going that's particularly interesting is that you're currently building the world's largest electricity storage system in Germany. So 2 questions. Why in Germany, and why particularly in the county of Baden-Württemberg? Are there specifically favorable conditions there energy-wise, or is it just funding was there?
That's good point. So let me actually correct that a little bit, because it isn't the world's largest in terms of capacity, but it is the world's largest for this specific use case. So it's the largest contracted project right now where storage is providing transmission services and is really supporting transmission infrastructure. Where we see storage elsewhere is, for example, for capacity markets, ancillary services, or time shifting of energy. There is larger projects out there, in particular in the United States, in California, and Fluence has been involved in some of the largest that are being built there as well. But this is a very specific, but very much an emerging and critical use case that's often overlooked. And this is really nothing to do in particular around the state of Baden-Württemberg or the specific location. But Germany is playing a very much leading role in developing storage as a transmission asset. And this is part of what's called the Netzbooster program, or in English, Grid Booster. And this specific project is being developed by Transnet BW, and they're the transmission system operator in this specific part of Germany. And they got funding as part of the network integration plan to build one of these projects. However, there is a further thought to it, and that's that the Netzbooster project and the overall program is helping to alleviate some of the constraints between the north and the south in Germany. So where we have a lot of generation in the north, a lot of demand in the south from the industrial centers, it is helping to manage the flow of electricity between the north with a lot of generation, in particular wind, and the south where we have that demand. And then the specific location is in Kupferzell, and that's a major grid hub that was identified by Transnet through their grid studies, where it's a very strategic location. There's existing congestion and constraints. So the storage system there will have a very, very much heightened effect on helping making that existing infrastructure more efficient, and therefore also stabilize transmission costs for energy consumers.
Well, now, actually, your answer closed some loops in my mind, because Transnet BW is a name I heard several times already. I think they were also at the Smarter E. They seem to be quite an innovative grid operator or transition operator. So that somehow made click in my head. So that's the one thing. And the other thing you answered is that It's quite interesting that even though it's based in South Germany, it actually has an effect on the grid stability all through Germany up to the north.
Correct. And actually, if you think about the overall plan that's outlined in the German network plan, there will also be similar nets booster placed in the north of the country. So basically, you will start having similar projects operated by different TSOs, both in the north and in the south. And as these are intelligently managed and interconnected, on managing those flows of electricity, it increases the ability to utilize existing transmission infrastructure and help shift that electricity from the north to south in a more effective way. The other solution is to build lots of transmission lines through the whole country. And quite frankly, a lot of people are maybe somewhat opposed to that build out of new transmission lines. And it's also very costly because you're building over hundreds of kilometers new transmission infrastructure.
Ooh, that's really interesting, because I think that is one of the bottlenecks there is in Germany for the rollout of renewables, and that is really getting those transmission lines across Germany, mainly because every little county, every little village is opposed to having these lines in their territory. Now they wanted to start, instead of like having them, from pole to pole, they wanted to go underground, which is much more expensive, etc. And that really slows us down by years and years and years. So what you're saying is having storage strategically placed all over Germany could really fasten up this process and maybe even take down the need of building these additional transmission lines.
It certainly reduces the need for additional transmission lines. Whether it completely gets rid of it, that's another question. I think that really depends when you're looking at the holistic grid planning perspective, but it reduces the need for it. And it also reduces the operating cost. So therefore, ultimately, that affects energy costs to the consumers. And it will also allow for the reduction of what it's called redispatch in Germany. So these are preventative measures that the TSOs takes, where they basically dictate how power plants should be either increasing or decreasing their output. And they have to then pay these power plant operators for it. And it's done to ensure the transmission system is operating safely. But even in 2021, according to the BDEW, a German association, the cost of those redispatch measures was exceeding 2 billion euros. And that's a very high cost that ultimately everyone pays on their bill. So one of the critical goals of the nets boosters as well is to reduce the need for redispatch, because you're utilizing batteries operated by the transmission system operator that can respond in milliseconds and help restore the system accordingly.
Which, quite frankly, brings us back to the question we had in the beginning. Why is there such a big gap between the ramp up of renewables versus the ramp up of storage? Bears a big question mark, because it seems like closing that gap would save us a lot of money. We'll leave that as an open question here, because the answer obviously is not up to us, but to the regulators. But coming up to another question, a strategic question. So originally gas-fired power plants were supposed to serve as the bridging technology in the energy transition. So now obviously, with the war in Ukraine, that strategy fell into pieces. So is battery storage then an alternative, and how?
Yes, storage is an alternative, and it's actually probably one or the pivotal alternative to providing flexibility to the energy system. So a role that often has been taken on by natural gas power plants, because they are fairly easily ramped up and down compared to, for example, nuclear, coal, or of course intermittent renewables. And storage really is the pivotal alternative to do that. One of the obvious examples where storage has already displaced gas-based generation is ancillary services. So when we're looking at the provision of frequency regulation in Germany, we have over 500 megawatts of battery storage already providing frequency regulation. In countries like the UK, Ireland, that's even higher. And there we really see where you need fast response to restore or to provide balancing services to the grid. Battery storage is the most cost-effective and most suitable technology to do so. We've also seen that storage is one of the lowest cost of capacity. So that's basically, if you think about it, backup capacity for the grid. If your demand exceeds your supply, you need to quickly be able to discharge a battery storage system or increase generation. Storage, again, is one of the lowest costs of providing that capacity. And also, and this is quite important, storage is multi-use case, right? You can utilize a storage asset for many different things simultaneously. But of course, we have to also recognize it's not generation. So the power has to come from somewhere, and then you store it and then you discharge it. So that is the fundamental difference. So therefore, it can only function as part of a change in the energy system, utilizing more renewables, but also thinking about the integration of demand response, flexible loads and other flexibility assets to counteract and displace gas completely. But certainly in many of the obvious examples, ancillary services, capacity markets, reducing wholesale volatility, storage is the solution. And it also means that long term, we no longer rely on gas as the marginal assets in our wholesale market, which again will bring down price volatility for customers.
We've basically framed all of our discussion so far around Germany and South Germany. Maybe let's expand the scope a little bit. In which European markets are the general conditions for grid storage particularly favorable? And maybe where are they particularly unfavorable?
Yeah, great question. And I think it's important to look at this across Europe because storage has a role to play not in a single market, but across the continent and also in markets outside of the European Union, but within our geographical constraints. So what I would say is storage goes usually through a cycle. So battery energy storage has been deployed very quickly, originally for frequency regulation. Markets like the UK, but also Germany and then Ireland were really the leaders in Europe. But we're now seeing a shift where those markets get saturated and storage is chasing new revenue streams. So with regards to that, the United Kingdom remains the largest and probably the most advanced market in Europe right now. We're also seeing Ireland as a very strong market for energy storage because of the specific frequency regulation ancillary services procurement scheme. We're seeing a very strong business case, for example, in Belgium, and we saw a very significant capacity market auction in Italy. So all those markets certainly are showing a lot of growth, but also we're seeing, as you mentioned, some new markets emerging. And I think this is really interesting. And part of the reason for this is the energy crisis and the increasing wholesale price volatility, in particular looking at the Netherlands, Nordics. People across Eastern Europe are talking about storage as a key asset to increase infrastructure efficiency, but also mitigate concerns regarding energy security. When we think about unfavorable markets, I would say no market is per se unfavorable because a lot of fundamentals mean that storage will be needed and is needed, but often the barriers are much more related to either regulation being slow to change, or sometimes it's just an education gap, right? This is a new technology and it's incredibly complex for policymakers, regulators, stakeholders to understand. But I would certainly point out Spain, where specific regulatory barriers are hindering storage from really realizing its full potential. I mean, Spain should be one of the markets where storage can have a very immediate impact paired with renewable power plants, but very kind of specific regulation there is hindering the uptake or is undermining the business case. And then I would say there's education gaps in particular as we're looking across Central, Eastern, Southeastern Europe, where there's a clear interest. But certainly stakeholders still have some way to go to understand the role storage can specifically play within their energy market.
And that's quite interesting. And just on a side note, because I think there was a lot of angst around Brexit that the UK rolls back all sustainability efforts. So it's quite good to know that at least in the area of renewables, they seem to be doing a pretty good job. And I think it's not only around storage in other areas, at least they didn't roll back as much maybe as we feared.
I think the UK is an interesting example. I don't want to get into politics on this, to be very honest. As a German living in the UK, I have maybe certain views around it or find certain things challenging, but also certain things very positive. I think there's still clear push towards renewable targets and decarbonization, but there's also a lot of kind of conflicting interest and challenges. The one thing I would say, regardless of the renewables picture, storage has really been embraced by stakeholders in the UK. And that's really thinking about, as an island nation with limited interconnection, a lot of the challenges you see within the UK grid or the Great British grid are exacerbated and almost like what the continental European grid might look like in several years' time, because you just have less interconnection and less ability to push electricity to your neighbors or take electricity from your neighbors. So therefore, storage has really been embraced. And I would say storage has been at the forefront, or the thinking has been at the forefront of the system operator, of the regulators, and the role it can play to better manage the grid. And therefore, I think we've seen a real leadership in the UK market when it comes to storage, regardless of renewable targets and climate goals, because it comes down to economics. And if this is the most efficient way to manage balancing services and manage the grid, then we should go and pursue it.
Now, that does sound very interesting. I would love to go deeper into it. We're already almost at the end of the podcast. I want to come to one term that I think we discussed without naming it directly, and that is virtual transmission. Because as you mentioned, the expansion of transmission grids is expensive. It takes a long time. So is what we discussed earlier actually, can you summarize it under the buzzword of virtual transmission, or would we need to add one or the other sentence to that?
No, I think that's exactly the point made earlier when we talked about the Netzbooster program in Germany, right? Instead of building an additional transmission line, you have a energy storage system either side of an existing line. And by that, you can increase the utilization of that existing transmission line. Because the way a transmission system is usually operated is it's based on an N-1 principle, right? So you basically always leave spare capacity in case there's a problem, in case a tree falls onto the line or whatever issue you might be facing. And by having the storage systems, you basically integrate that backup capacity into your grid, and therefore you can increase the utilization of the existing line that is there already, and you may not need to add another one or may need to add two in order to have that contingency. And that's really where virtual transmission comes in. But I would also be very cautious of limiting it to that virtual transmission concept, because storage as a transmission asset has multiple other benefits. It can provide black start capability to repower the grid after an outage. It provides what's called synthetic inertia, which is basically as we're losing spinning reserves or traditional generation that have an inherent inertia because they're synchronous. What we're now seeing is utilizing storage systems and inverter-based technologies to provide kind of synthetic inertia to mimic what has been traditionally part of the system based on the generation mix.
It's been really so interesting to talk to you. And I'll just summarize, I think, the gist of what we were discussing. And that is that storage is just so much more cost effective than a lot of alternatives, as you mentioned, specifically also not only in the grid system itself, but of course also pitted against alternatives in the fossil space. We also heard that there still is a big gap, and we certainly need to close that gap and ramp up storage equally to renewables. We also heard that storage really is a multifaceted solution, which is really, really great, that you cannot only use it for one purpose, but it solves multiple problems in the grid with one storage facility already. Thanks a lot, Julian.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Zach. Absolutely. It was great to be part of the podcast.
You can find everything about future-proof solutions for renewable energy storage and innovative battery technologies at EES Europe, Europe's largest and most international exhibition for batteries and energy storage systems takes place from June 14th to 16th, 2023 in Munich. More information can be found online at ees-europe.com.